let's review NBA history a decade at a time, ranking each decade, giving them a grade on different categories and an overall grade, starting with the 1960s. While the 60s aren't the very beginning of the league, I think this is where the NBA truly gets its foundations of greatness. This is an era marked by gritty, physical play and emerging stars. Of course, the Boston Celtics, led by Bill Russell, dominated this decade. And then you have Wilt Chamberlain, who set records left and right, including his 100-point game or 50-point season, many records that stand today. But let's start with our category number 1, and that's entertainment value. Now, the NBA struggled for mainstream attention. Really, few games were even televised. That's one of the explanations of why we don't have any footage of the 100-point game, for example, and some of the conspiracies that follow that game. But really, many of the feats that happened in this decade were only witnessed by relatively small audiences. But I really think this is an underrated style of play during this decade. You have no three-point line, super fast-paced basketball, and you have a little bit different rules early on in the game. I think players were probably more skilled than you might realize if you haven't watched much of this era. But overall, when it comes to entertainment value, I'm going to give the 1960s a B-. Now, category number 2 is star power. Now, like I've mentioned already, you have guys like Bill Russell in this decade, 11-time champion, absolutely an icon defensively, really by any era standards. Of course, you have Wilt Chamberlain, who's arguably one of the best scorers ever, defenders ever, rebounders ever. You have guys like Jerry West, the logo, or Oscar Robertson, the original triple-double guy. You have Elgin Baylor and many others. As for overall star power, I'm giving this era, the 1960s, an A. Now, there are less players than other eras that are going to come up, but this is to pay respect to especially guys at the top of this list who paved the way and were truly stars in their era and were dominant. Now, the next category is competitiveness. When it comes to competitiveness in the 1960s, here's the thing. The Celtics won 9 championships, including 8 championships in a row. Parity was more than limited, and that Celtics team was absolutely stacked, especially compared to the rest of the league. But at the same time, they were laying the groundwork for future growth to come. When it comes to competitiveness, though, I'm giving this era a C-. Now that brings us to the last category, which is the overall grade I'm giving the era. And the 60s is a great one to start. I mean, interior play dominated this era, guards faced tough rim protection, and you have no three-point line, so you really have no other option. But especially by the end of the decade, creativity really started to flare, and I think if you go back and watch some of the games that are available, you might be surprised at the skill that these guys had during that era. As for an overall grade, I'm giving the 1960s a B+. I think it's a solid era. The players that played in it were legendary. Obviously, they have some things working against them being the pioneers of the NBA, but I think a B+ is a fair rating for this era. And that brings us to the 1970s. The 1970s is an era of parity, of innovation, and then you have the influence from the ABA. But let's start with entertainment value. Basketball in many ways becomes more entertaining in the 70s, at least the style of play. And a lot of that has to do with new players, new teams entering the NBA with the NBA-ABA merger. Overall, when it comes to entertainment value, I'm going with a B- for the 70s, and I'll explain why as we get further to competitiveness and other categories. But let's talk about star power. The newness of the league brought some more excitement, but the stars in the 70s, I think they lack a little bit compared to other eras. Of course, you have Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who was dominant in the 70s. You have Julius Dr. J. Irving, who is, a guy who gets underrated often, but by the time he enters the NBA in the 70s, I think he's on the tail end of his prime. You have Walt Frazier, Earl Monroe, Bob McAdoo, Bill Walton, and others. But in many ways, this era was carried by Kareem and Dr. J, in my opinion. And for that reason, I'm giving this era a C+ when it comes to star power. That brings us to competitiveness. This was definitely an era of competitiveness and parity. You had 8 different champions in that decade, with no one going back-to-back. Of course, adding 4 new teams to the league helps when it comes to competitiveness and parity, but at the same time, there was a little bit lacking in this era to me. So when it comes to competitiveness, I'm giving it a solid A. When it comes to the overall grade of the 1970s, I'm going to give this a B, just slightly below the 60s. I think it's a little bit of a dull era compared to the other ones. Let me know if you agree with that or disagree in the comments, please. Now that brings us to the 1980s, often referred to as the golden era of the NBA. Now, the golden era is marked by the rivalry between the Lakers and the Celtics, of course. The 80s is when the league's popularity took its first soar. Media exposure increased, and Magic and Larry are totally responsible for that. When it comes to our first category, entertainment value, the Showtime Lakers versus Birds Celtics became must-see TV. And the finals frequently featured those two teams, captivating audiences and bringing an intriguing storyline to the NBA. The Lakers reached the finals 8 times in this decade, winning 5 of them. The Celtics reached 5 times, winning 3 of them. And the two teams faced each other, fulfilling that rivalry 3 different times. I mean, what can you say about the truly historic rivalry between these two storied franchises? When it comes to entertainment value, the 1980s get an A+ in my book. Next, that brings us to star power. Now, of course, Magic and Larry were the faces of the league at this time. And then you have guys like Michael Jordan emerging, and you have the last years of Julius Erving's career, Moses Malone, Isaiah Thomas, and of course Kareem is still there on those Lakers teams. I think this is a star-studded era, but I think it's a little too top-heavy. I'm going to give it an A- when it comes to star power. As for competitiveness, the Lakers and Celtics combined for 8 titles. And then you have the Pistons and Sixers, who were also successful. I think while that Lakers-Celtics rivalry was great for the NBA, it does take away a little bit from the competitiveness, with a little bit of lack of parity. When it comes to competitiveness, I'm going to give the 1980s a B grade. When you think of the 80s, you think of athleticism, you think of team play, and you think of the storylines. You think of Magic and Bird. Also, the NBA's marketing reach was really growing at this time. As a decade, I'm giving the 80s an overall grade of an A. Next up, we have, of course, the 1990s. And let's call this decade what it is. The Jordan era. Of course, Michael Jordan led the Bulls to 6 NBA titles, including 2 three-peats during this decade, and he became a global icon and grew the game a ton. The NBA really took a step here internationally as well, including gaining fans internationally and bringing new players from other countries into the NBA. Now, as for entertainment value, I think the Jordan Bulls era, the memorable finals runs, are really important to consider here. You have a lot of game winners, and I think this is what makes the Jordan highlight reels crazy, is how entertaining his game was and how entertaining those Bulls teams were. Not to mention Hakeem's back-to-back championships as well. Now, I know it's not technically NBA, but you also have the 1992 Dream Team a part of this decade, who were a big part of that global expansion effort. When it comes to entertainment value of the 1990s, I'm giving this an A+. As for star power, you obviously have Michael Jordan, you have Scottie Pippen, you have Charles Barkley, John Stockton, Karl Malone, Hakeem Olajuwon, Patrick Ewing, Shaq's drafted in '93. You even have a young Kobe, young Allen Iverson. This was an era definitely filled with stars, with Michael Jordan being the biggest star. I'm giving this an A+. Now, when it comes to competitiveness, the Bulls, as I mentioned, dominated this era, and in the 2 years that they didn't, well, 3 years, but the 2 years in between those 2 three-peats, you had the Rockets winning back-to-back championships. And then to cap off the decade, you have the Spurs winning in '99 in a shortened season because of that lockout. Now, the playoffs did feature iconic moments, but you had 4 teams win over that decade. I think there was definitely competitiveness, but because of the lack of parity when it comes to championships, I'm going to give this a B- when it comes to the 1990s and competitiveness. Now, when it comes to the overall grade of the 1990s, that's a little bit different story. I think the global impact is really important. I think the iconic moments of Jordan's career are really important. I'm giving the overall grade for the 1990s another A, just like the 80s. Next up, you have the 2000s. I think this is, the new millennium, and you have another rise in athleticism. I also think this is where you get some more superstar-driven teams. You have the Lakers dynasty, you have those Pistons years, and of course you have the Spurs in this era. When it comes to entertainment value of the 2000s, I think of the dunk contest, I think of high flying, big highlights. I think of crossovers, I think of clutch moments, I think of Kobe, I think of T-Mac, guys like that. But of course you have Shaq dominating this era for sure. And then you have a juxtaposition with the Spurs and Tim Duncan, who are playing almost a different brand of basketball. You have defensive teams like the Pistons, and overall for this decade, you have a slower paced game. A lot of people living in the mid-range, a little bit less threes than some of the coming decades. I think I'm going to give this an A, and the reason I'm not giving it an A+ for entertainment is I think for some fans, it's a little bit too slow looking back, but I think the other things are all there, including our next category, which is star power. This, of course, is a decade of superstars. You have Kobe Bryant, you have Shaquille O'Neal, you have Tim Duncan, LeBron James is drafted in 2003, Dwayne Wade, you have Kevin Garnett, Allen Iverson, Dirk Nowitzki, Steve Nash. I mean, this list goes on and on when it comes to stars of the 2000s. And for that reason, no question, I'm giving this an A+ when it comes to superstars. For competitiveness, you have the Lakers and the Spurs dominating a lot of this era, but you have the Pistons, the Heat, you have the Celtics who broke through. I think during the 2000s, playoffs grew a little bit more unpredictable than previous eras. I mean, from the year 2000 to the year 2009, there were 9 different MVPs named. That alone shows you the level of competition. When it comes to competitiveness, I'm giving the 2000s an A-. Now, overall, this was a blended era of physicality, of style, of athleticism. You have an interesting era of a different type of offense from today's game, a different type of offense from previous eras, and you have strong defense still existing in the league. You also have a team like the Phoenix Suns emerging with that 7-second offense, with Steve Nash, with Mike D'Antoni, laying the groundwork for some of the era to come in the 2010s. Overall, as a decade, I'm giving the 2000s an A-, just slightly below the 90s and the 80s. And that brings us to the 2010s. The 2010s are a decade that represent innovation, they represent global movements. It's a transformative era both on and off the court for sure. And the regular season and the postseason delivered high drama. This is the decade where the NBA becomes more accessible than ever. You have technological advances with NBA League Pass. The rise of social media brings fans even closer to players' lives. And then naturally, you have the global fan base, which was rising and growing. This is a decade that features the Heatles. You have LeBron going back to the Cavs. You have KD going to Golden State. You have the Cavs-Warriors rivalries. I mean, this era is just filled with drama. When it comes to entertainment value, this is no question to me an A+. As for star power, you have the transition from Kobe to LeBron as the face of the league. You have Kevin Durant rising to an MVP level, all-time great level player. You have Steph Curry, of course, Kawhi Leonard, James Harden, Russell Westbrook. You have the rise of Giannis, who wins an MVP in 2019. I mean, during this era, you have 7 different MVPs over the decade. When it comes to star power in the 2010s, this again, no question to me, A+. Now, competitiveness, let's just run through the championships real quick. It starts off in 2010 with Kobe's last championship. Then it goes to Dirk's last championship on that historic run in 2011. From there, LeBron's Heatles go back to back. Then you have Duncan's last championship to finish off his career. Then, of course, you have the Warriors and Cavs rivalry. And then to cap off the decade, you have Kawhi and Toronto's historic run. I mean, seriously, this is 7 champions, including back-to-back champions. And you're including guys like Kobe, Dirk, and Tim Duncan, who are getting their final championships before retiring a little bit later. What more can you ask for when it comes to playoffs and championships in a decade? For me, again, no question, this is an A+. And as you would imagine, if I'm giving those categories an easy A+, the decade as a whole also I think gets an A+. This is a decade of innovation. You have the 3-point impact from Steph and the Warriors, transforming the game a lot more to what we see today. You have a little more versatility, and then this is the beginning of the player empowerment movement. It's such an interesting decade filled with drama. This very well might be the best decade of basketball in NBA history. That brings us to our final decade, or at least part of it, with the 2020s. The 2020s get off to an interesting start. You have the COVID or bubble season, but then you have the rise of non-American players especially. You have Giannis, Jokic, Embiid, Shea, Wemby, and others, but it gets a little complicated when it comes to entertainment value. For example, I have mixed feelings about the bubble. You have the detachment of fans from the bubble, no live audience. But at the same time, it was peak hoops. There was a lot of entertainment, a lot of good basketball being played. At the same time, this is the decade where you hear a lot of reports about lower ratings, but that gets complicated with the advances of streaming and other platforms. And then you have competitive moments with a lot of parity in today's NBA. The CBA brings another factor when it comes to free agency and team building. I think this is what it is to me, is this era, or this decade rather, is very entertaining for obsessed basketball fans. As for casual basketball fans, I think it's a little less entertaining, maybe harder to follow in some ways. We've heard people express on the biggest platforms how they miss super teams and so forth, so it really depends on who you are as a fan. Currently speaking, I'm going to give the decade an A when it comes to entertainment value. When it comes to star power, I'm also going to give this an A overall, not quite an A+. You have LeBron winding down in the NBA, you have the end of Steph's prime, the end of KD's prime, unconventional stars like Giannis and Jokic, and then guys like SGA, Anthony Edwards, Ja Morant, Jason Tatum, guys like that who are filling the shoes of previous superstars. I think it lacks some of the traditional star impact when it comes to marketability and things of that nature. The players, the skill is totally there, but for that reason, I'm giving it an A rather than an A+, because I think when it comes to marketing, things have changed quite a bit. Now, when it comes to competitiveness, that's a different story. This decade so far has been total parity. We've had a different champion every single year. In many ways, it's been maybe more unpredictable than any other decade. You have the Pacers making the championship this year. You have the 5 seed Mavericks making it last year. You have the 8 seed Heat making it in 2023. I mean, it's been unpredictable in many ways. So when it comes to competitiveness, I think this decade so far has been an A+. Overall, so far, this decade has been an A overall grade with room to grow to an A+, or really room to drop a little bit lower. It's been complicated, but it's been great so far in my opinion. If you would have asked me in like 2022 or 21 or 20 even, I probably would have given this a lower grade, maybe even a B or B-. But things have kind of picked up and I've enjoyed basketball a lot lately. You also have the drama of free agency and the complications of the CBA that have added other factors to the NBA. But the thing is this, each decade is unique, it's different in its own right. They've each introduced new stars, new icons, new styles, new innovations, and of course, new storylines. The NBA has evolved from a niche, US-based sport to a total global entertainment powerhouse. There's been changes in the past, and there will continue to be changes when it comes to innovation, technology, style, strategy, stardom, all the above. It's what makes the NBA the NBA. But I want to know from you, what do you think is the best decade of the NBA so far? I'm considering doing videos on each decade, going into more detail, more history in separate videos. Let me know in the comments if that's something you'd be interested in. And thanks for watching Sports Pantheon.